you very much, Stephen. Good morning. It's nice to be with you. And I sort of feel redundant following the cartoon. Sorry I haven't got such a luscious beard. It'd be quite nice to have that white mouth flashing in a dark beard, wouldn't it? It was, but that was the story we're looking at, where Abraham is called to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And it's a well-known story, but it is strange, isn't it? I mean, gosh, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? The theme that you'll be looking at over the next few weeks is the shadow of the cross. And it just struck me that Revelation says, all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And so somehow, in God's heart and mind, Jesus was slain from the creation of the world. And it's difficult to get your mind, but it does enable you to see that there can then be a shadow of that coming across history. It would be strange in a way if the biggest event ever to happen in our world, where the Son of God came from heaven to live amongst us and die on a cross, to be raised from the dead and ascend into heaven, if that event wasn't in some way prefigured in all that went beforehand. And I'm hoping that we'll see this morning that it's not just a vague sort of hint. It's really clear. And that's so we'll be looking at Abraham. I came across, while looking for this, the word exegesis is Greek, reading out of the text what is there. But there's also eisegesis, which is reading into the text what is not there. And I thought, well, let's have some X, but we could do without the ice. And so our text starts off, sometime later, God tested Abraham. I mean, God tested Abraham. God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you. So does God test us? James says he does. He says, consider it in James 1, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And so God was testing Abraham. He wasn't tempting him. A test is to bring out the good in us, not the bad. The test is to help us succeed and not to fail. And so a chap called R. Mobley says the two key words are test and fear. A model for God's people, obeying him no matter what he chose to apply to them, for he would always prove to be a God worthy of their trust. It's possibly to discover how far Abraham would be obedient to the covenant stipulation a couple of chapters earlier in 17:1, where God says to him, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. A chap called Derek Sheriff said, this is the most specific test of loyalty and obedience that could be devised. And so Abraham faces this test to sacrifice his only son in Isaac. I came across it, I thought it was also helpful to set it in the context of the thinking of the day. Because now, we don't think in the way they thought then. I don't think we're sort of very much aware of our rights and, and all that sort of thing. So I thought this was helpful It says that in the people of Abraham's day, to the Jews, it was self-evident to Israel that all life belonged to God and was his to grant and dispose of as he chose. The firstborn were particularly marked out as belonging to the Lord. The law states, "You must give me the firstborn of your sons," meaning that they were entirely at God's disposal for him to do what he wanted with them. But they would not question God's right to ask for such a sacrifice, and it is precisely because of the contradictory nature of this idea that the command to Abraham is a particularly suitable test. Child sacrifice was common in the surrounding nation, but it was forbidden to the Jews. In Leviticus 18:21, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of the Lord your God." And in Jeremiah 19:5, it says, "They have built pagan shrines to Baal, and there they burn their sons as sacrifice to Baal. I have never commanded such a horrible deed. It never even crossed my mind to command such a thing." And so this is what God is like, and yet out of this comes this test. And so you're holding sort of two things in tension. Things you understand and know about God, and then something comes along that is sort of doesn't quite seem to fit in, and you have to sort of hold the two together in tension. I remember Paul Newbury, who used to lead the church at in Brewer Street, in Manor Church. He said that if your theology leaves you with a bad attitude to God, he said, park that bit of theology until you can resolve it, so you don't end up with a bad attitude to God. And there are some sort of bits of theology you're thinking, oh, that's harsh, but we have to sort of hold certain things together. I came across a series, I won't go through it now, but a series of texts that talks about the duality of God. We're so keen on the love of God, but it's like in your wrath, remember mercy. And there are a whole string of texts that put these two things together, that God, there's more than one side to God. It's got God's character. And Abraham, so I think Abraham is having to cope with these sort of things. It's a real test for Abraham. Now, as readers, we're led into it as a radio program where they announce the question. They've got to guess the answer, and they say the answer will appear on the laser display panel, and everybody laughs. You always assume they've got some flash to the thing, but chances are somebody's writing it up on a blackboard or something, and sort of so the audience are in. They know the answer, and so they can enjoy how the other people who don't know it find their way. And we've sort of been let in to know that it's a test. But Abraham didn't hear that. He didn't hear a voice saying, "This is a test. This is a test." It's not like that in life. Thing comes our way that test us, but we don't know at the time that it's a test. So Abraham then, following 25 years of God's blessing, the promised child Isaac had been born, and he's getting on well with his neighbours. He has already received 13 promises from God. No man had received more. And then comes this test. Interesting, isn't it? That sometimes at the peak of your life, a test can come along that you didn't expect. It says the greatest of these is faith, hope, out of faith, hope, and love. And this tested all three. Take your son was the faith test, your only son, the hope test. All their hopes of the future were invested in Isaac, whom you love, the love test. And so his whole faith, hope, and love were being tested. And what was Abraham's response? Well, it said early the next morning, Abraham got up. His obedience was prompt. Someone said that delay is the craftiest net of Satan, and few escape from it. So when God prompts you to do something, do it promptly. He got up early the next morning. I would have had a lie in, wouldn't you? A bit of a think about it. It was a difficult day coming up, very difficult day coming up. You know, let's give it time just to settle in, mull it over. Did I really hear that? But Abraham was prompt. He got up early the next morning. His obedience was conscientious. He's got to organise his servants, get the ass. He's got 2 servants to take with him, get the ass with him. And then he's got to take the wood with him. But he leaves that to last. And that was sensitive because he didn't want to stress Isaac more than he needed be. Oh, thanks for putting the image up, by the way. I found a number of images on this subject, and a lot of them were sort of engravings. It might have been Jura or somewhere, a bit religious looking and a bit grim. And I thought I found this one, and I don't think it's anything to do with the countryside of where we're looking at. And I think there's even a church in the middle of the ground somewhere. But a nice European painting. I thought, oh, that'll be. At least that sets the scene about it. So his obedience was prompt, it was conscientious. His obedience was firm. He had to go on a 3-day journey. Moriah was 45 miles away. So he's got a 3-day journey. And all the time he's thinking, crumbs, I'm going to kill my son. Am I going to kill my son? Am I really? But his obedience was firm. And we sometimes have to sort of, you know, when we're going to obey God, it's sort of like, it's not like all over in an instant. We then have to do it again. And we have to sort of conscientiously push through with things. His obedience was solitary. He'd left his wife at home, and then when it came to the crunch, he'd left the servants behind as well. Calvin makes a note. He said that he left his servants behind when he went on ahead with Isaac, so that the servants wouldn't intervene, because Abraham was getting on, and he's probably over 100. So they probably thought, the servants probably thought, gosh, what's this doddery old bloke doing now? No, he's got the knife, you know, and they might have intervened, but he thought about it. His obedience was trusting. It wasn't sort of just like blind faith. He'd thought about it. He'd reasoned it. In Hebrews 11, it says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Faith does not demand explanations. Faith rests on promises. The promises that he had received was that the whole world was going to be blessed through his offspring, and part of that was through Isaac. So Isaac was a vital link. He'd had a go at providing somebody else, and he had Ishmael, but God said, no, it's not through Ishmael, it's through Isaac. So he'd underlined the point that Isaac, the promises rest in Isaac. And he sustained himself with the promise of God that through Isaac shall your descendants be named. There was no precedent for what was being asked of him. That's interesting, isn't it? You can't think, oh yeah, I know somebody else who's been through this. Nobody else had been through anything like this. And I don't think anybody went through anything like it again. Yet, I think it's just interesting to note that Abraham he had quite a track record with God. He trusted God, his friend. In James 2:23 it says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. Isn't that amazing? So for the bulk of his life, he'd gone through life knowing God as his friend. And he had expressed confidence in God's justice. In Genesis 18, there's the story of the three men that come down, angels probably, and one of them is the Lord, and they're going to look at Sodom and Gomorrah and are going to destroy it eventually. But when and God says, then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then the Lord told him, he said, so when God had things to do, he wanted to share them with his friend, with Abraham, his friend. And the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing. You see, he knew God. They were friends. Far be it from you. I know what you're like. You wouldn't do that. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. And here comes this great catch-all phrase, which is really an interesting one to know. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? It's great. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? You can rest. Whatever queries you have about God's judgment and God's dealings, here's a great one to, will not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said to him, okay, if I find 50, then Abraham spoke up again. What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5 people? If I find 45 people there, he said, I will not destroy it. And the story goes on. What if only 40? What if only 30? What if only 20 can be found there? What if only 10 can be found there? Can you imagine having this conversation with your boss? You know, where you push and you push and you push to sort of affect his mind. And God says in the end, okay, even if I find 10 righteous people there, I will not destroy. So this story just illustrates the sort of relationship that Abraham had with God. He was friends with him. He knew what God was like. And then he had to face this test. It's been pointed out that Abraham believed God and obeyed him when he did not know where, when, how, or why. Hebrews 11:8, Hebrews 11:9, Hebrews 11:11, and Hebrews 11:17. So in all those things, God called him to leave, to go somewhere. He didn't know where he was going. When he didn't know when the child was coming. When he didn't know how it was all going to work out. And now when he didn't know why. But we trust God. And as we know God, we can build on our knowledge of God. That God is good. And so we can go with it. Calvin says, but when he came to the conclusion that the God with whom he had to do could not be his adversary, although he did not immediately discover how the contradiction might be removed, he nevertheless, by hope, reconciled the command to the promise, because being indubitably persuaded that God was faithful, he left the unknown issue to divine providence. What a good position to be in, where you trust God and the things you don't know, you leave to divine providence. On what could Abraham depend then? He couldn't depend on his feelings. There must have been horrible pain within him as he contemplated slaying his son on the altar. He loved his son, but he also loved his God and wanted to obey him. He couldn't depend on other people. His wife was at home. Can you imagine trying to explain this to your wife? But he couldn't rely on there. But Abraham could depend on the promise and the provision of the Lord. Abraham's faith, he trusted God sufficiently to entrust God with his most precious treasure. He had already, and in a sense, he had already experienced the resurrection power of God in his own body. Romans 4:18, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. So he knew that God could raise Isaac from the dead, if that was his plan. And so he trusted God. And then the focus changes from the father to the son. And it's interesting, as you read it in Genesis 22, the narrative slows down. You don't really hear anything of the 3-day journey, so it all happens very quick. But as they get to the place of sacrifice, the story slows down, just like the Gospels. The Gospels go through quite quick until you come to the last day and the last hours, and then it slows right down as the focus is on the sacrifice. And so we're looking at the willing submission of the son. How old was Isaac? Bit of debate here. If you look at drawing, so various people have said, I'll just tell you what they say rather than, he may by this time have arrived at the age of some 18 to 20 years. Someone else says now Isaac was 25 years old. Adam Clark said it's more probable that he was now about 33. Isaac was then upwards of 20 years of age. Someone else, a youth of sufficient strength and agility to carry a load of firewood up a mountainside, affirmed that his son had grown into a man, and the meaning in Isaac's case could also mean young man, because the text says the boy or the lad. But actually, when we arrived at the church so many years ago, the youth group, you could go to the youth group until you were 35. And it always amused me. But the person who ran the youth group was sort of a great guy. And anyhow, so the lads. So the upper limit is 33. Could it be he was mature? And so it's all the more remarkable the submission of the son. The son could have overpowered the father when he saw what was going on, and yet you get this impression that the son was submissive to his father's will, probably shared his father's faith, and this is an unmistakable picture of Christ. So, and the wording, take your son, your only son, whom you love. In Matthew, a voice from heaven said, this is my son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased. And again in Matthew, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love. And so the language is sort of to reflect this sort of, so when people hear about Jesus, they sort of put the two together. Take Isaac, your only son, whom you love. This is my son, whom I love. And that God so loved the world, gave his only son. And carrying the wood on his back. A Jewish writer in the Jewish Midrash, a systematic exegesis of the book of Genesis, produced around 450, wrote, and he's not a believer, Isaac with the wood on his back is like a condemned man carrying his cross. And the imagery is so tight. You've got Isaac with this wood on the back walking up the mountainside. And then think back to when Jesus carried his cross going up the hill to Calvary. The imagery is just so strong. It's not just a vague illusion. It says, but the test was passed and now could be stopped. When God looked at Abraham, he saw a father with an only son whom he was prepared to sacrifice. He saw an image of himself. Powerful, isn't it? A powerful story. Somewhere it says that this is the only text in the Bible that indicates that God wanted a human sacrifice, the only one. And the thing about Isaac, as willing as he was, Isaac was not adequate as a sacrifice. But the father also is willing to sacrifice the son as an offering that will make atonement. And it's the prize. It wasn't just the fact that he was going, the prize in view with the sacrifice was that you would make atonement. It says, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. What a prize that God has in mind. Hebrews 12:2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For the joy set before him. He could see the purpose, what it was doing. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. What a prize, reconciliation, peace with God, not just for one nation, but for all who would open their hearts to him. Romans 8:31, what shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Isaac parallels all believers. The ram took his place. Christ died in our place. It was a substitutionary atonement. And Isaac portrays that for us. And God provided himself with a ram. And there is a picture of a ram. Again, another image, a ram caught in the thicket. A ram has got its head surrounded by thorns. Such a powerful image, isn't it? And when they put the crown of thorns on Jesus' head, it recalls all this sort of imagery that God has provided himself with a sacrifice. It's interesting to note that Abraham had to turn around. He turned around and saw a ram. And sometimes we have to turn around to see Jesus, to repent, to turn around and see what God has provided, to take our eyes off the things around us, turn around and see that God has got his great provision. And now, if we could have the map, because the map, I was going to put this up first. It's not a great map, the best I could find. And it gives away the story. The place, Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah equates to Jerusalem. What in the imagery and the prophetic word in 22:14. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. And the mountain of the Lord was Jerusalem. And that was fulfilled when Jesus was crucified, carried his cross up the hill. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Now apparently Mount Moriah is a clear pun on the name. Moriah means provide, but may equally mean see beforehand. So God sees the need and sees to it, while at the same time God himself is seen. God commended his love to us in this: while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. If we want to see the love of God and see what God is like, we look at Christ and we see that he died for us. God himself is seen. Moriah then is the place where God is to be seen in the beauty of his generous grace and provision. The Lord sees and/or the Lord provides. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will see. That is, God will take care that everything shall be done that is necessary for the comfort and support of those who trust in him. Hence the words are usually translated, the Lord will provide, because his eye ever affects his heart, and the wants he sees, his hand is ever ready to supply. But all this seems to have been done under a divine impulse, and the words have been spoken prophetically. Hence the Lord shall be seen. And this translation, the following clause, seems to require, as it is said to this day, on this mount the Lord shall be seen. This is Bishop Warburton, by the way. From this it appears that the sacrifice offered by Abraham was understood to be a representative one, and a tradition was kept up that Jehovah should be seen in a sacrificial way on this mount, so that Abraham offered Isaac on that very mountain on which, on the fullness of time, Jesus suffered. Another writer says, the same God who set the test in sovereignty is the one who resolves the test in graciousness. In a world beset by humanism, scientism, and naturalism, the claim that God alone provides is as scandalous as the claim that he tests. And so it's an amazing story, a shadow of the great sacrifice that was to come. And at the end of it, God reinforces a promise and gives him a new promise, the 14th promise for Abraham. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and that's probably yet to be fulfilled. But it's spiritually fulfilled now. And all nations on the earth will be blessed through him. And just at the end of that chapter, there's a little bit, a few verses, says sometimes later, Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor. I won't try and read them all out, but it's just a list of names. So he's saying that his brothers and wife have had a string of children. And you'll notice that in that name is Rebekah. Later on, Rebekah is going to become Isaac's wife, who will then give birth to Jacob, Israel, and the whole story sort of moves on. And it's just this wonderful sense of sort of coming together, of Abraham trusting God. He knew what God was like. He was willing to cope with the seeming contradiction in his life. And he trusted God, and he came through it. And it's an example to us all to trust God and to obey him. Amen. Thank you very much.